What is going on, guys? I am Paul Ryan, your host of the Not ATB Fantasy Show. If you're new to the show, thank you for joining us. And to our regular listeners, welcome back. With me, as always, is my co-host, the best co-host in the world, and creator of the Pigskin Papers website, Mr. Dave Pigskin Papers Hartman. Dave, how are you?
I'm doing great, Paul. I'm wearing my Colgate sweatshirt here. That's my alma mater. They punched their ticket to the
Oh,
NCAA tournament tonight,
very
beating
cool.
beating Lehigh to win the Patriot League championship, and it's the fourth straight year they're going to March Madness. Haven't gotten out of the first round. It's a small conference, so they are usually like a 14 or a 15 seed and play somebody that they have no business playing, but they've hung with those teams. So I know we're not going to talk much about basketball on this show, but I did watch some college basketball tonight. But anyway, other than that, I'm doing well. First couple of days of free agency has been pretty crazy, like drinking from a fire hose, trying to keep up with all the moves. Teams got money when the cap went up, and they're spending it. Other than a
Yeah.
couple teams we'll talk about. So anyway, I'm doing well. How are you doing tonight, Paul?
I can't complain. My wife and I, we were watching Survivor. It was a good episode. I don't know if you're a Survivor fan or not, Dave, but
I
that's
watched the
our show
first
that we like
season,
to
Paul. I
watch.
watched the very first season, and that was it. What are they up to? Like 15 seasons, 16?
Oh, beyond that, 40, 46, I think.
Really? Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
I did
We
not
have a
know.
question for you, Dave, from Butterscotch here.
Yes, I'm at the Vermont Estate, Butterscotch. Thank you for asking. Yes, I did watch that game up here.
Well, Dave, before we get too off track, buddy, where can we find you on not Twitter, aka X?
Yeah, I'm not Twitter, aka X. I'm at Pigskin Papers, my website where I post a lot of fantasy football content during the season is thepigskinpapers.com. I'll have some off-season content. Do not have much up there yet, but I will. And Paul, where can people find you on X, and where can they get at all your Cowboys and other content?
Yes, I am Paul Ryan. You can find me on X at Paul_Ryan15, and all of my content is on either streaming on X or streaming on Twitter. I think I'm on like 50 days at least of streaming, going not necessarily live, but recording a video, uploading it to YouTube, doing some more short form content, which I've really been enjoying, Dave. I kind of keeps you fresh, if you will. Getting
Yeah,
more reps in. Those are always important.
excellent. Okay.
So yeah, you mentioned free agency, Dave, and it's been a couple weeks since our last recording, but I'm glad to be back. The Super Bowl has come and gone, and day 3 of free agency is over. It has been a wild and unpredictable free agency period, but I'm excited to talk about the moves that have and haven't been made. This week, we're focusing on the latest running back and quarterback moves, and next week, we'll discuss the wide receivers, tight ends, and everything in between. In true show fashion, Dave and I will start off the show with our favorite teams, the Miami Dolphins and Dallas Cowboys. So, Dave, the Miami Dolphins lost a big-time player in Christian Wilkins. How do they recover and as a potential replacement on the current roster?
The Dolphins came into free agency with the second worst cap situation in the NFL. Only their division rivals, the Bills, were further over the cap. Even when the cap went up as much as it did, Miami still had a lot of problems with the cap, which makes sense if you look at their roster. They have some very high-priced veterans, guys like Tyreek Hill and Jalen Ramsey, Bradley Chubb, guys like that who are making a lot of money. And it's pretty rare. I obviously hope they were going to keep Wilkins. I mean, I think he's one of the, he's probably top 5 at his position. He's 28, so he's in his prime, and defensive tackles tend to last longer in the NFL than a lot of other positions. A lot of them play pretty well into their early to even mid-30s. And it's actually pretty rare to see a player of his quality even hit free agency, at his age. So I was obviously disappointed as a Dolphins fan, knowing they were going to have to let him go, but they.
Oh, guys, we have lost Dave. We were talking about Christian Wilkins, former defensive tackle, leaving the Miami Dolphins, and I was asking him his thoughts. Miami Dolphins being Dave's favorite favorite team there. And of course, we know that Christian Wilkins has left. He signed a mega deal with the Las Vegas Raiders, a division opponent there. It's an interesting move for the Raiders for sure. I mean, they
I
added
don't
to
know
that
what
defensive
happened
line.
there. I'm back.
No worries. I was filling in the gaps for you, Dave. Just kind of trying to
That
keep
was
things
weird.
going for you.
All of a sudden, the stream just went dead, and I had to reconnect. So, basically, I'll wrap this up quickly on Christian Wilkins. He had 9.5 sacks this year. That was a career high, but it wasn't just that. He was kind of all over making plays, forcing turnovers, a lot of quarterback pressures and hits, and he's very stout against the run. He got a ridiculous amount of money in Miami. I don't think they could have paid him that, and still managed their cap situation. They also lost defensive tackle Raekwon Davis. They do have another very good defensive tackle who's also 28 and is a lot less expensive in Zach Sealer. He actually had 10 sacks last year and played really well, and they just redid his contract. So the answer is no. I don't think Wilkins is easily replaced. I think defensive tackle becomes a position that Miami's going to need to address in this draft. I don't really think they'll address it all that effectively in free agency. And it's a big loss for that defense, but, not a fatal one. And I think, it's a great get for the Raiders. They put him next to Max Crosby, and all of a sudden, neither one of them ever comes off the field, and that might make their defense really strong. I'm not sure that the Raiders are like one big defensive player away, and they've got bigger problems. And I was a little surprised that they were the ones who threw that kind of money at him. But congratulations, Christian Wilkins. He got, he's one of the highest paid defensive players in the NFL now. And that's one other thing I want to say before we get too deep into the show. With the cap going up, you keep hearing, that so-and-so player is now like the third highest paid, whatever, fill in the position in NFL history. It's all kind of meaningless because the cap keeps going up, and the money that's getting thrown around for guys like Chris Jones, Christian Wilkins, and some other players, even like a Kirk Cousins at his age, kind of getting paid almost what Patrick Mahomes is getting paid. At least for the next 2 seasons, the money is kind of just getting silly, and you can't really compare it to contracts from 5 years ago or even 3 years ago. So anyway, I'll stop there. Let's shift for a second now to your team.
We can skip the Cowboys, Dave. It's fine. It's no problem.
Well, the Cowboys appear to be skipping free agency, so I want to ask.
Hey, we made a move today, man. Come on.
You got Eric Kendricks today. Congratulations. He's a good linebacker. He's not a young linebacker.
Veteran presence is always helpful, right?
Veteran presence, and they, with Leighton Vander Esch kept getting hurt really since Sean Lee left. They kind of haven't had a thumper in the middle. So that's probably a good ad for them. But they've lost a few key players early in free agency, and they're kind of known for not being all that active early. What do you predict from the front office for the rest of this offseason? Jerry Jones made a statement earlier this offseason about the Cowboys being quote unquote all in this year. What's that going to mean? What do you think is going to happen?
Jerry, man, one of his traits, if you will, his skills is he knows how to get people talking about the Cowboys. He knows how to grab headlines, and sometimes you can't always trust Uncle Jerry, man. He says a lot of things, most of the time he doesn't even know what he's saying. I think he's just talking to us, Dave. But as far as what the Cowboys are going to do this offseason, I mean, I think if you've been a Cowboys fan for 5-10 plus years, you kind of understand what their strategy is in the offseason, how they approach free agency is. I think they'll spend their money wisely, aka they'll be cheap. They'll draft well, and they'll rely too much on Dak Prescott and the coaching staff. Really, that's kind of how things go.
All right.
And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, we've kind of saw, I was surprised at what we saw from the Cowboys last year in free agency, where they signed Malik Hooker. They brought back Donovan Wilson. They re-signed Leighton Vander Esch, and then they went out and made the trades for Brandon Cooks and Stephon Gilmore. Those were some difference-making moves, and they got them up those players who ended up making an impact in the season at all different points of the season. And they got them at a Cowboys price, a Stephen Jones price, something he likes to do. He likes to trade fifth-round picks, compensatory picks, and grab players at a discounted rate, veteran players who, are maybe a year away from being out of the NFL or a year away from maybe getting their second chance in the NFL. I know you missed all that, Dave. I was just trying to fill the void there, but
I'm getting a message that says I should turn off my virtual background. I actually don't have a virtual background on, but I'm blurred.
Mm-hmm.
Let me unblur.
Yeah.
And see if that makes a difference, because I think I have to update my browser or something, because both times I got kicked off, the screen just all of a sudden it just said reload and I was dropped from the stream. So let's see if this if unblurring my background, now you can, Butterscotch can see the palatial estate. There's just a white wall behind me. Nothing.
I like that Backstreet Boys poster you have in your room, Dave. That's nice.
Hardly. You won't find that here. I do have a Springsteen poster downstairs and one of the Neville brothers, but no Backstreet Boys.
I was gonna say, I just saw when my wife and I were watching Survivor, there was a classic rock guy who's going to be doing his like a show on CBS, very popular. I can't remember his name, and that annoys me because he's got a lot of hits. He's like one of those mega stars from the 80s. Getting back to football here, Dave. We looked at Miami last year, and man, they really kind of caught everybody by surprise with their offense at the first half of the season, and they look poised to make a run in the playoffs, only for injuries to take over and ruin their potential playoff run. Is health the only thing holding them back, or do they need to make some upgrades to the roster?
It's an interesting time for the franchise because, Tua is the one quarterback from that 2020 draft class, of the first 5 taken, who hasn't been extended yet. And they kind of need to do that this off season, because next year is his 5th year, his option year. And I don't think they want to get into a situation where they're franchise tagging him. I think they've seen enough from him. I mean, we could have a whole show talking about whether Tua is the answer or not. He hasn't won a playoff game yet. He did lead the NFL in passing yards last year, but other than that one Cowboy game, they didn't really beat the teams they needed to beat, really good teams. Teams that made the playoffs, and then they lost to the Bills at the end of the season, and then they lost to the Chiefs in the playoffs. So that's going to be, and that's part of the reason that they're going to be so strapped for money this offseason is whatever they're going to do with Tua. Then they're going to have to pay Waddle a year later. I do think that their defense just got so banged up. I mean, they lost everybody. They lost, 3 edge rushers over the last 5 games of the season, and they lost their middle linebacker and lost a corner. They just, you can never have enough depth in the NFL, is I think what I learned. I will say this, in as much as it was painful to see them lose Christian Wilkins, I actually they've made like a couple of sort of low-key, lower profile moves so far in free agency that I think are the kind that won't cost them compensatory picks and are good players that are going to help them. They brought in Jordan Brooks, a very good inside linebacker from the Seahawks. They brought in Jordan Poyer, safety from the Bills, which, that's good. You're taking a very good player from another team in the division. They what's his name? The center they signed. I'm forgetting the name right now. Jordan Brewer. That's who it was. And they also added Jonnu Smith. They were kind of weak at tight end last year.
Yeah.
He's a pretty good player who, is not a household name by any stretch, but he's been a pretty good offensive player the last few years. So I kind of like the cost saving moves they've made. They haven't committed a lot of money to any of those players, really. Jordan Brooks making some decent money, but I think Greer, their GM, is managing this offseason as best he can so far. But, they're not the best team in their division. Aaron Rodgers is coming back next year. The division's only going to get tougher with the Jets potentially being, a playoff
Right.
caliber team. The Bills aren't going anywhere. And the AFC is loaded. It's good that the Dolphins have made the playoffs each of the last 2 years as a wild card, because that's not that easy to do in the AFC. And with Joe Burrow coming back and CJ Stroud having another year and Jim Harbaugh coming to the Chargers,
Mhm. Yeah.
it's not going to be easy to make the playoffs in the AFC, but I think they certainly should be in the mix. And then we'll just see what happens. Let's go back to the Cowboys for a second. They got embarrassed in the playoffs this year. They had that good win 2 years ago against the Bucks, then
Yeah.
lost to the Niners. Then this year they go out in the first round at home, get blown out by the Packers. Mike McCarthy and Dak Prescott are effectively kind of on 1-year deals. Do you think the Cowboys are on the brink of a rebuild, reload type season, or is this really just a continuation of the very good but not great, like can't get over the hump team that we've seen for the last couple of seasons?
So it's funny, Dave, because prior to free agency starting, when Jerry Jones made those comments about going all in, I asked the people on YouTube on our page. I made a little video and I asked if Mike McCarthy and Dak Prescott not being extended this offseason, could that be a form of going all in, being that maybe this is the make or break year for both of those guys, and you decide not to spend the money on Dak, you let McCarthy walk, and you just kind of maybe see what you have in Trey Lance. Maybe you try to draft a guy, you let Cooper Rush play, and maybe see what you have in those guys. And it's kind of a win-win situation, right? You either find a diamond in the rough and a Trey Lance, or you are bad enough to where you have a top 10 to 5 pick and you can draft hopefully maybe your franchise quarterback. I don't know. The Cowboys, Jeff Kavanaugh, one of my favorite Cowboys content creators, he likes to say this. He always says this, that the Cowboys don't want to be bad. And that's probably why they'll never get over the hump, because they're not willing to reload or rebuild for a season or two. They're not willing to do what it takes to acquire those premium draft picks and really get those difference-making players. So, I want to say that we are close, but just based on that, I'm not sure that we are. I think maybe it could be for McCarthy, but I can't see Dallas letting Dak walk. I really can't.
Yeah, no, I hear you.
So your other favorite team, Dave, the New York Giants, have been aggressive and active early and gotten better on both sides of the ball. What are your thoughts on their offseason approach thus far?
Well, the big headline is Saquon going to the Eagles, which I think from a football standpoint, it's the right thing. Like,
oh yeah,
a running back who's been in the league for 5 years and is now 26, 27 years old. I understand not giving him that kind of money at this point, but for Giant fans, him leaving and him going to the Eagles is like, it's a gut punch. And I've heard a lot of Giant fans in the last few days be extremely upset about that, but they understand it. The Xavier McKinney loss is a big one too. Him going to the Packers. The rumor was that he was also going to the Eagles, and Giant fans were ready to jump off buildings and set their hair on fire. McKinney's a very good player. He's been hurt a few times on his rookie deal, but he's played well when he's been healthy. Kind of a ball hawk player who's just sort of seems to be around the ball all the time. So losing those two obviously is significant. And in the case of Barkley, it's not just what he does on the field. He's kind of been, not only one of their best players, but a little bit the face of the franchise. He's really been a positive guy in the community. The reporters love him. The fans love him. And now they got to face him twice a year. That said, the Brian Burns ad is a pretty huge one, and they got him at a discount. A year ago, I think the Panthers could have gotten more than just one first rounder for him.
Mm-hmm.
And now, it only costs the Giants a second. I mean, the Giants have 2 seconds. It's the better second round pick that they have, but a second and a fifth for a guy who's he may not be one of the 3 or 4 best pass rushers in the league, but he's certainly in the top 10.
Yeah,
He
yeah,
had a little bit of an off year last year. The Panthers were just so bad.
yeah.
And teams just were able to run on them. There were less obvious passing downs. I mean, I think Burns is a double-digit sack guy, and now you're putting him on a defensive line with Dexter Lawrence and Kayvon Thibodeau, and
Ojulari as well.
defensive line could be. You think about how the Giants won Super Bowls. The strongest thing on their team was their defensive front, and the ability to get pressure with just 4 guys and not have to blitz a lot. So I think that's a tremendous ad for them. I'm not sure where they are in their evolution as a team. Sort of like the Raiders getting Christian Wilkins. Like, were the Giants one pass rusher away from contending in the NFC? I don't think so. I think they have other problems they need to fix, not the least of which is, is Daniel Jones the answer, or isn't he? And are they, they can get out of his deal after this year. But I think the Giants have, it's been an interesting couple days for them, but the Burns trade was really a pretty big and important one. They also shored up their offensive line a little bit. So overall, I'm a little bit optimistic about them. And they also brought in Devin Singletary, who is not a great running back, but last year when he got the opportunity to kind of be the main guy for the Texans, he was pretty effective. And the Giants aren't going to replace Barkley with one guy. I could see them, maybe drafting a running back on day 2. That's sort of been the way the NFL has been going, instead of spending money and high draft capital on running backs, you just get these day 2 guys. And a lot of them slot in as pretty good players right away. So I think Singletary was an adequate. I mean, you look at some like the Cowboys. I mean, it's one of the things I wanted to ask you about. Like they were not part of this whole running back sweepstakes, and their starting running back went to the Titans. So at least the Giants got a competent running back to at least start to replace Barkley, and I thought that was important for them as well.
Definitely. Well, let's talk about let's stick here with the running back theme here, Dave. And I'm curious, what is your biggest takeaway from the first couple of days of free agency?
Well, it goes back to what I was saying at the beginning. Like, the cap went up and teams are spending the money, which is, I guess, everyone's getting rich, and that's fine. Watching all those running backs switch teams was just kind of like crazy. I mean, you look at like the NFC North. Like, David Montgomery used to be a Bear, now he's a Lion. Aaron Jones used to be a Packer, now he's a Viking. Like, I think there's one other one in that division. I'm banking on it, but like they all these guys in that division of DeAndre Swift was a Lion before he was an Eagle. And now he's a Bear, right? So you've got all these like guys going against their former teams twice a year, or the teams that drafted them, really. So that's kind of interesting. I think it's funny that they call this the legal tampering period. As a lawyer, that's like, to hear the word legal next to the word tampering just doesn't sound right. Tampering generally is something that is illegal.
Right.
I think it's funny that the league calls it that. I mean, the other takeaway I have is that we see this every year. There are some general managers that seem to know what they're doing and consistently do well, and franchises generally. So that might have to do with the owner being less meddlesome also. But like, you look at, the Ravens with Eric DeCosta and the Eagles with Howie Roseman and a couple of other franchises. I think Chris Ballard, the Colts, typically does pretty well in free agency. Like they don't overcommit and, throw stupid money at players that might be 1-year wonders or
Right.
who've gotten hurt a lot. And then there are some teams that sort of year in and year out, you kind of scratch your head and say, what is Trent Baalke doing the Jaguars, and what are the Panthers doing, and and some of these other teams. Not that all their moves are bad. I think the Jaguars have made some very good moves in free agency, but you sort of each year you kind of see some of the same teams having good off seasons, and you wonder, why other teams can't seem to get that right and consistently make mistakes in free agency. What are your takeaways from these first couple crazy days?
I just really what I've been just kind of borderline shocked is that teams really do value running backs. I mean, of course, fantasy footballers, the fantasy community might not really value them. And there for a while, it didn't seem like the NFL did. But you look at these contracts and how aggressive some of these teams were about getting their next guy, getting, what you would have to assume is their starter, and the money that they're getting paid. It does feel like maybe the running back position is valued again.
Well, we'll get more into that as we get into some of these specific moves. But let's talk for a second with a sort of a basic question, and we can both answer this one. Paul, what signing or trade that's happened this week do you think is the most impactful? And this is from an NFL standpoint, not a fantasy standpoint. We will talk a little bit of fantasy football later in the show. And which so most impactful, and which one did you find the most surprising?
Oh, okay. So we're doing two. I'm sorry. I did one, but I was genuinely shocked with the Josh Jacobs signing to Green Bay. I mean, I couldn't believe it. I thought it was fake. But then, of course, not too long after, Aaron Jones gets released and he signs with another team. But that was a move I didn't expect Green Bay to make. And I just didn't even think a running back was on Green Bay's radar. So to see that happen, that was interesting. How about you?
Yeah, I mean, for me, well, I would say the most impactful, this is kind of the chalk answer, but I think Kirk Cousins going to Atlanta. I just think it's impactful because that's a bad division, a very winnable division.
Mm-hmm.
I think the Falcons, with all that draft capital that they invested in Kyle Pitts and then Drake London and then Bijan Robinson, 3 top 10 picks on skill position players. And then they just kind of didn't have, an NFL caliber starting quarterback, really since Matt Ryan's last season where he was off. They've just been weak at that position. They've got a good offensive line. And obviously Cousins is 36 and he's coming off a serious injury. But if he comes back to anything close to the kind of efficient, high volume passer he's been the last few years in Minnesota, that could really change the Falcons' offense and Arthur Smith is gone too. So like the best players should be on the field. That's been
exactly
with them. And, Pitts and London and Bijan have all flashed, but it just hasn't been consistent production. So I think that's the most impactful for me, or has the potential to be, if Cousins is right. To me, the most surprising was just with the Panthers trading Brian Burns a year after they should have traded him. I mean, I just don't know, go back to the Christian McCaffrey trade and the DJ Moore trade. I'm just not sure what even I mean, look, a lot of people thought Bryce Young was going to be, the next big thing. I did not, but they gave up a lot for that trade too. To move up and get him. I just don't know what this team is doing. And they could have gotten a lot more for Burns. If he wasn't in their long-term plans, they should have traded him a year ago instead of just kind of giving him away for not very much right now. So that surprised me. When they franchise tagged him, I didn't really think they were going to tag and trade. You don't see the tag and trade happen all that much in the NFL. I don't think it had happened with a premier player in a couple of years. So that was surprising to me.
Yeah, it could happen with T. Higgins too, which would be a surprise.
It could. It could. I don't think the Bengals want to let him go, but they are a
Yeah,
cheap organization, and they're going to
yes,
have
they
to pay
are.
Jamar Chase. And
Right.
if it's one or the other, it's going to be Chase. I think if Joe Burrow has his say, it'll be find a way to keep both of them. But he has requested a trade, so we'll see what happens with T. Higgins. I mean, the
Yeah, we
price
will.
for him should be like a mid to late first round pick. And I don't think the Bengals would take less than that for him. So we'll see if someone's willing to do that and pay him.
Yeah, because see, that's the thing though, is I can't see a team willing to trade a first round pick while also having to make sure to get him to commit to a big contract too, you know.
Yeah.
So it has been running back galore early in free agency. Are running backs great again in 2024, Dave? I know we're kind of hitting this one on the head.
Yeah, I don't think so. I think there are a
Oh
couple
wow.
factors. I think there are a couple factors here. I think there just kind of so happened that this offseason there were a bunch of good running backs hitting the open market. And the reason they're hitting the open
Right.
market is because their teams don't want to pay them and don't value them and know that they can reload in the draft and just find, good players who can play the running back position. So it almost, to me, the fact that so many good veteran running backs hit the open market speaks to the fact that teams don't value them the way running backs used to get valued. And here's a way to think about it, Paul. Saquon Barkley got a 3-year, $36 million deal, right?
Mm-hmm.
Roughly. Gabe Davis got a 3-year, $39 million deal, right? So who's a
Yeah.
better player, Gabe Davis or Saquon Barkley? It's not close. I
Not
mean,
close. Yeah.
Saquon Barkley was the number 2 pick overall and is a top 5 running back in the NFL when healthy. He's great in the passing game. He's great at the goal line. He's a good blocker. He's an electric runner. He's not as fast as he was. Gabe Davis is probably a top 30 receiver in the NFL. They got paid the same money. Barkley is roughly getting the same money that Nick Chubb got 3 years ago, and the cap has gone up significantly since then. So I don't see that any of this is a reflection that anything is changing fundamentally with the economics of how the league looks at running backs. I just think, having Saquon Barkley, Josh Jacobs, Derrick Henry, Tony Pollard, and then some lesser guys, Joe Mixon, Devin Singletary, Gus Edwards, Aaron Jones, going into his 30-year-old season, but
Mm-hmm.
it's just unusual that so many of these guys were available and teams need running backs. So I think that's a big part of it. I also think this draft is not as strong at running back as most of the recent ones. And so part of it might have also been teams saying, you know what, maybe it isn't going to be that easy this time around to find a guy in the second or third round who we can plug in as, if not a starter, like an important committee back in year one.
Yeah.
So we'll go with a veteran and then we'll draft a running back, next year, or we'll draft one later.
That makes sense.
So that's kind of my take on the whole thing. But like you said, the running backs flying off the board was probably the most interesting part of free
For
agency.
sure. Yeah.
I mean, it was, just kind of crazy. It was like every 10 minutes, but the deals, none of the deals are that big. If you look at, they're the biggest ones are in that kind of 10 to 12 million a year range. And that's just not.
That's a lot for a running back in this.
A lot for running back, but it's not compared to other positions. You got defensive tackles making more than twice that, like Chris Jones, Christian Wilkins. So,
right.
And they're around the same age as a lot of these running backs. But running backs age differently, right? Like at 28, you're kind of like, okay, well, thanks for your career.
Exactly. Yeah.
But an interesting thing, Paul, some of the teams with less experienced quarterbacks, like Green Bay, Chicago, who's presumably going to be starting a rookie, Tennessee, who's, got a QB that only got a few starts as a rookie, went out and grabbed experienced running backs pretty quickly in free agency. What do you make of that? Do you think there's a connection there, or is that just the way it happened.
We're starting to see teams wisen up a bit, and they're doing anything and everything they can to take off any sort of pressure from their inexperienced or even rookie young quarterbacks, or whatever you want to say. But yeah, that they like to do that. And that's a smart thing to do. Having a good running game does that. Having a good defense does that. Surrounding that quarterback with good wide receivers, passing weapons, things like that. I mean, anything you can do to make the quarterback's life easier is always a smart thing to do. And that's one of the best things you can do for a young quarterback is to give him a good running game.
Yeah, agree.
Which running back do you like least? Or excuse me, the Baltimore Ravens added Derrick Henry to their backfield. Dave, is that good or bad for Lamar's fantasy value?
A fantasy question. I love it. We're going to talk about fantasy the next few questions here. So this is not the ATB fantasy show, so we will discuss a little fantasy. I mean, I think it's probably overall neutral for Lamar's fantasy value. I mean, he may lose a few rushing touchdowns, but when you can add a guy like Derrick Henry to an offense that is just so running back friendly, and kind of envisioning the two different running styles, really the three different running styles of Derrick Henry, Keaton Mitchell, and Lamar Jackson in the same backfield. Now, I don't think Mitchell and Henry will be on the field together that much, but running a read option with Henry and play action with Henry, I think is really going to help that offense. If Lamar can win an MVP with Gus Edwards back there, he can certainly, and Justice Hill, he can certainly win an MVP with Derrick Henry back there, even at age 30. And I don't think Henry's a 300 carry guy anymore. I think they'll probably, he'll probably see, in the neighborhood of 15-ish touches a game. You never know. But I just think I know the Ravens they've been sniffing around Derrick Henry for the last couple of years. And this was like one of the most obvious pairings, I think, when free agency opened, just because of the way the Ravens run their offense and how important a strong running game is for them. And I think Henry will do well there. I think it's a great landing spot for him. And I don't think it's going to hurt Lamar's fantasy value at all. If anything, I just think it makes their offense better and more dangerous and harder to defend. And that ultimately benefits Lamar. Well, what do you think about that? Were you concerned about a little regression, like rushing touchdown or rushing yardage regression for Lamar?
Yeah, I think it helps. It will take a lot of pressure off of Lamar. He lost some rushing volume in TDs for sure, but his long-term health will benefit, and so does his dynasty value. We saw Lamar, just a couple years ago when he had his first MVP season, he passed for over 30 touchdowns, and he had a good running game at that time. So it'll be exciting to see what this Baltimore offense will do. Yeah,
I agree. I think this was one of the more obvious and one of the best signings so far this week. I really like what the Ravens did, adding Derrick Henry. So speaking of just all these running backs and from a fantasy perspective, which running back signing did you like the least for fantasy purposes?
I hate that DeAndre Swift signed with the Bears. Chicago already has Roschon Johnson and Khalil Herbert. And just last year, Chicago had over 530 rushing attempts, and almost 3 players had over 100 carries, not including Justin Fields' 124 rush attempts. Chicago is going to have the dreaded 3-man backfield. So I didn't really like that move. How about you, Dave?
Yeah, I didn't like that one. I have that written down. And I also didn't quite get the Tony Pollard to Tennessee because when I look at Tyjae Spears, I think he does a lot of the things that Tony Pollard does. They're both good pass catchers. Spears in limited, they had Derrick Henry last year, right? So Tyjae Spears, didn't get a ton of opportunity because also Henry stayed healthy. And even when the Titans were out of it, they kind of just kept riding Henry, which was a little strange. I thought they would have given Tyjae Spears more of a look, but that one to me Now I don't know how to think of either of those guys from a fantasy perspective, because 2 years ago, Tony Pollard was, from an efficiency standpoint, from almost every standpoint, he was one of the best fantasy backs. The issue was just they also had Ezekiel Elliott, who scored 15 touchdowns, and that depressed Pollard's value. Then last year, Pollard kind of had the job to himself, and despite all the points the Cowboys scored, Tony Pollard was like not even a top 15 running back last year.
Yeah.
It was, there were all these games where they scored 40 points, and the Pollard manager is looking at the box score and scratching his head and going, wait a second, this team scored, 6 touchdowns and Tony Pollard had 8 fantasy points. Like, how's that possible?
Yeah.
So now with the Titans, now with Spears and Pollard, I mean, I assume Pollard is going to be the lead guy a little bit more, but they kind of do a lot of the same things well. I don't know how good that offense is going to be. I mean, they did add Calvin Ridley. I don't know if you saw that. That was pretty late.
I did.
That was
Talk
pretty
about a shocking move.
Late in the day today. But,
yeah.
Obviously they're trying to give Will Levis all the help they can.
Right.
But I don't know. That one to me, and the Swift one, those are the two that I wrote down that I just kind of creates muddled backfields and depresses everyone's fantasy value on both teams.
I'm a little interested in Tennessee and fantasy this year. You think about Will Levis, DeAndre Hopkins, Calvin Ridley, and then Tajay Spears and Tony Pollard. That's that could be a dynamic offense depending on how Will Levis develops and the coaching scheme and everything.
Yeah, no, it could be. It's kind of an unknown, right? Like,
exactly.
That's one of those offenses we don't really know what it's going to look like until we see it.
Right, right.
I also think Gus Edwards to San Diego was another one that kind of, I don't know, like, it's easy to get 5 yards of carry on the Ravens, like every running back does. Thank you, Jordan. We just got a nice comment from Jordan Stock. Appreciate you.
Appreciate you, Jordan.
And appreciate your feedback and your kind words. Thank you for joining us tonight. And if you have any questions, Jordan, you can put them in the chat and we'll try to get to them before the end of the show. But, Gus Edwards was one other one. I didn't, I just don't know. I know that Jim Harbaugh likes to run the ball and then run it some more. I think they'll draft a running back also. I don't think it's going to be all Gus Edwards, but
right.
Gus has always been like kind of the backup and the complimentary guy. I don't know about him as kind of like leading the way for that Charger offense. So we'll see.
Yeah, we will see. It'll be interesting. You talked about this player a couple minutes ago, Dave, but which running back signing do you like most for fantasy purposes?
I think for fantasy purposes, I like Josh Jacobs to the Packers. I know Jacobs he had a bit of an off year last year, but that's a running back friendly system. It's a team with a lot of good offensive weapons, a good young quarterback. They move the ball. You saw what Aaron Jones did in the playoffs, and before, like their last 5 games, he was over 100 yards, scored a bunch of touchdowns. 2 years ago, Jacobs was one of the 2 or 3 best running backs in the NFL. Last year he held out. I think that probably that never works out, right? Running backs that aren't ready for training camp and they're not in shape. The Raiders were not a good offense and they didn't have a quarterback. What's his name? AJ Dillon is likely gone. So Jacobs could be a true 3-down back in that system. And on that team. So I like that a lot for fantasy. And I think he'll be look, maybe he'll be overdrafted and he'll disappoint. But from what we saw 2 years ago from Josh Jacobs, I like that pairing. How about for you? Which signing of a running back did you like the most for fantasy purposes?
I really thought you were going to say Derrick Henry, so thank you for saving him for me. But yeah, I like the deal the Ravens signed Derrick Henry to. $8 million is a little steep for a running back of Henry's age, but the pressure he'll take off Lamar and the pressure he adds to opposing defenses will be well worth it.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy. I was looking at this. The last 5 years, Derrick Henry has been the running back 1 or the running back 2 in yards, just in rushing yards. The only year he wasn't was that year he got hurt. And when he got hurt, he was leading the league in rushing. So he really, like he doesn't bust those long runs anymore. Like he once he got moving, like when he was a little younger, he had some good high end speed. He would have those 80-yard touchdown runs. I don't think you're going to see too much of that from him anymore. But last year he had his share of, 15, 20, 25, 30-yard runs. He can still do that. And I agree with you. I mean, in that system, he's just going to see big rushing lanes because they have to worry about Lamar. And he's, if Gus Edwards is getting to the second level and taking on linebackers and safeties, Derrick Henry doing that is just more yards, right? Because when those guys go to tackle him, he gets another 5 yards. So, I like that too. I just don't know what kind of workload they're going to put on Henry. So at his age of 30, and they're going to want him for the playoffs. So, I do think Keaton Mitchell will get his chance too.
Same.
And maybe get 10, 12 carries a game. We'll see.
I would think Baltimore would use Derrick Henry as like the goal line back, the closer in the fourth quarter.
Yeah, I think
things
so.
like that.
Yeah, they've had trouble. That's a good point, Paul, because in recent years, they've had a little trouble closing out some games. Like that Colts game last year, the Dolphins game the year before. They've lost some leads, and they want to run the ball. So, having Henry, I mean, you saw it with the Titans other than last year. They would get a lead in the second half, and they would just keep giving the ball to Henry. So maybe we'll see some of that.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Paul, which running back do you think gained the most fantasy value from free agency, from what we've seen in free agency so far?
Yeah, so we're going to do one AFC and then one NFC. And AFC, I just talked about the guy. I think it's Derrick Henry, only because he's a little bit older, but because of the offense and situation, I think he might be overdrafted, kind of like how you feel maybe Josh Jacobs will, especially in best ball. I think Derrick Henry will be his value went up a couple of rounds. But then in the NFC, I mean, Bijan Robinson, you got to be excited about what's going to happen with him and that Atlanta Falcons offense. How about you, Dave?
Yeah, I wrote down for the NFC, well, Jacobs for the reasons I gave before, but also Bijan, I think that one is the coaching change and the quarterback change. I think last year he was drafted in the top 10 and he didn't live up to it. So his perceived value this year is going to be the same as last year, but I think this year he has a better chance to live up to it. In the AFC, I'll go like way, way off the board. But I have a funny feeling that Zamir White with Josh Jacobs on, I don't know how good their offense is going to be, but if they don't bring in anyone else, Zamir White looked pretty good at the end of the season when he got to start a couple games when Jacobs was hurt.
Yeah, he did.
And they just don't have a lot else at running back. I mean, maybe they'll draft someone, but if the question is just who gained the most value, well, he went from the backup to the starter, presumptively. Well, at least for now, I'll say Zamir White, but that could obviously change.
Right.
He's never been a starting running back before, but Kieran Williams had never been a starting running back before. James Conner behind Le'Veon Bell, he had never been a starting running back before. You never know when one of these guys gets an opportunity to start, and they haven't had that opportunity before, and there's not a lot of competition. We're talking about fantasy football, not real football. So opportunity is for running backs is half the game, if not more. So
yes, sir. So of course, when a player gains value, another player loses value. Which running back lost the most fantasy value after these recent free agency moves?
So we'll do NFC and AFC again. I mean, NFC, I'll say DeAndre Swift, only because he didn't have – I mean, maybe it's a bad answer because I don't think he had that much fantasy value last year. He didn't score a lot of touchdowns. He had a couple big games early in the season, but, they kept sprinkling in Kenneth Gainwell and – Hurts got all their rushing touchdowns, basically. I mean, he had like 15 or whatever it was rushing touchdowns. So maybe Swift didn't lose that much value, but It's sort of all the Bears running backs. Maybe it's him and Herbert and Roshan, like to your point earlier, they kind of all lost value because now
Yeah,
it's a three-headed thing, and
exactly.
you don't really want to spend much on any of them because you don't know what's going to happen there. In the AFC, I'll go with Tajay Spears only because
Mm.
it looked like you knew Derrick Henry was leaving, so it looked like Spears was going to be, the starter. The team drafted him, I think, in either the second or the third round 2 years ago. So they obviously had a decent amount of faith in him. The other one I'll say is Ramondre Stevenson. With Antonio Gibson going there, I don't know where Zeke Elliott's going to be, but
Yeah.
Ramondre went into last year as a, kind of a consensus top 10 running back, and he disappointed. And maybe the Patriots are kind of moving on a little bit. Because I think bringing in Gibson, he's a pass catching back. That's what Ramondre does best. So I think he lost value also. How about for you? What players do you think running backs lost the most fantasy value in each conference?
Well, Dave, I am determined to think that you have stolen my answer because AFC
I have
running back
not.
Tajay Spears and NFC running back DeAndre Swift. That's who I had written down. When you work
It's
together
just
along
great
with
minds,
somebody
Paul. It's
for
great
for this
minds.
long,
We've done a lot of shows together. We're just
yeah,
starting to think the same way.
that's exactly what I was going to say. Great minds think alike, and we've been working together for a little while now, so it's bound to happen.
Yeah. Well, sorry about that. You get to answer the next question, so I can't steal your answer. So running backs weren't the only ones signing deals. Obviously, we've spent a lot of time, as you said at the beginning of the show, we were going to spend a lot of time on the running backs. I
Yeah,
think we've touched on almost all of them that changed teams, at least the
right.
significant ones. But they weren't the only ones moving around. The big quarterback move, which I alluded to before, and it wasn't the only one, but it was the most high-profile one, was Kirk Cousins going to the Falcons. And, remember last season, we had Russ Wilson moving, we had Deshaun Watson moving. It was probably bigger news at the quarterback position and Aaron Rodgers than this offseason. But this Kirk Cousins one is obviously big. Do you think in Atlanta that he's destined to be a QB1 for fantasy purposes, let's say in 12-team, one quarterback leagues?
Yeah, Dave, I was looking up some cousin stats earlier for the show, and I have to say, no doubt about it. I mean, looking over his last 8 seasons, Cousins has thrown for over 4,000 yards, thrown 25 or more touchdown passes, and has 6 QB1 finishes in his last 8 seasons. And you know what? I'm going to call me crazy, but I think this team in Atlanta might be the best team he's ever been on, Dave.
Yeah, I hear you. I don't know. I mean, it's tough. The pass catchers he had in Minnesota were pretty elite. So,
Yeah,
um,
Diggs and Thielen and Jefferson there for a little while.
yeah, and Hawkinson.
Yeah,
So, and Dalvin Cook, for a while there
right.
was a really good pass catching running back. I mean, this crew in Atlanta, and they brought in Darnell Mooney, which, that was kind
Yeah.
of one of those low key ads, but
And they paid him some money too.
yeah, but Mooney had fallen off in recent years, but he wasn't in exactly a good passing offense. And Kirk Cousins has shown, be it KJ Osborne, be it
Mm-hmm.
At Jordan Addison last year, like he's not just going to lock in on one guy.
Right.
He's a progression QB. He can throw all over the field. So yeah, I mean, I think Kirk Cousins has in the last few years he's been like the QB8, the QB9, the QB10. Like in one QB leagues, he's been a QB1. He's been a lower end QB1, and I think that's what he'll be again. I mean, I still don't think he's going to be in the discussion with the top QBs, mostly because most of those guys run a lot and he does not.
Mm-hmm.
But of the QBs that don't run, there's kind of like him and Tua and Matthew Stafford, and they're all kind of in that kind of lower end QB1 range. And I think Cousins, there's no reason to think he won't be there again this year. I agree with you on that.
Absolutely. I'm glad we can agree, Dave. I like it when we agree. It makes me feel good.
Good.
So, with the addition of Kirk Cousins and the changes to the coaching staff, are the Falcons the favorite to win the NFC South? I believe you might have already answered this question earlier in the show.
Well, Las Vegas thinks they are because they're at minus
Mm,
110. So I will say yes. I mean, it's a bad division, and the Bucks are kind of old. I don't know what the Saints are doing. They've done almost nothing so far in free agency other than they had a lot of cap problems. And the Panthers are going to again be the worst team in football, I think. So yeah, I think the
wow.
Falcons. I think the Falcons are in good shape to compete for that division.
That's going to be a fun team to watch.
Yeah, they are for the first time in a while, I think. So staying in the NFC South, a quarterback that didn't change teams but that got paid is Baker Mayfield. He kind of had a career resurgence last season with the Bucks, led them to a division title and into the playoffs, and won a playoff game and almost won a second playoff game in Detroit. He was a top 10 QB last year. He landed a new deal. So for fantasy, and they kept Mike Evans. Do you think that he has value in one QB leagues, or is he just kind of you want him as your second QB in a super flex?
So you look at Baker, and he did finish last season as a QB1. He was actually the 10th best fantasy QB in 2023. But the big question is, how will he look without Dave Canales, right? Because last season was his best fantasy season and his only season as a QB1, I'll have to say no. I need to see him do it again before I value him outside of Superflex leagues.
I agree with that. You could do worse.
Yeah, you could.
But I think in 12 team leagues, I think there are 12 QBs you can name that are likely to finish ahead of him in fantasy. I mean, remember last year, Joe Burrow was not a QB1 because he got hurt. Anthony Richardson, who has a good shot at being a QB1 when healthy just because of the rushing, he got hurt and didn't play. Daniel Jones, who was the QB7 2 years ago, and I don't know that he'll ever have another top 10 QB season, was not a QB1 last year. Neither was Geno Smith, who was the year before. Neither was Matthew Stafford last year because he was hurt for a bunch of the years. So, yeah, I think it'll be tough for him to finish inside the top 12 QBs, but he'll probably be right around, the bottom of that and the top of the next tier, which is what you want as your QB2 in a super flex, honestly.
Exactly. Yeah. That 13 to 17 range.
Yeah, well, unless you can get two of the top guys.
Exactly, yeah.
And if you do that, I don't know what the rest of your team looks like. So
yeah,
that's
very
why
true,
it's so
very
much
true.
fun. That's why drafts are so much fun.
Yes, sir. Well, another quarterback that's changing teams and, is probably in need of a career resurgence is Russell Wilson. And he ended up signing a one-year deal with Pittsburgh, which was a bit of a surprise to me. He's now on his third team in 3 years. Could Mike Tomlin resurrect his career, Dave?
I mean, I guess it's possible. It seems like the whole world has soured on Russ. Statistically, he didn't have that bad of a season last year, but when you watch the Broncos, he didn't look like the same player, certainly, and he hasn't in his 2 years in Denver and his last year in Seattle. So he really hasn't looked like the same quarterback that he was earlier in his career. He doesn't run as much. He doesn't push the ball downfield as much. Look, they got him on a cheap deal, a very cheap deal, a very team-friendly deal. He's better than Kenny Pickett, I have to think, even at this stage.
Let's hope so.
So I think there'll be a battle there, like a camp battle. I think I would have liked Russell Wilson a little better going into this coming season if Deontay Johnson had stayed in Pittsburgh, because that guy's open all the time, right? He's easily 120 catch guy when he's healthy, or can be. And, that security blanket won't be there. George Pickens is kind of more of a so far kind of a highlight reel guy, but who doesn't put up consistent production. Pat Fryermuth's a pretty good tight end. I don't know that, I think they'll throw to the running backs a lot. They have two very good pass catching running backs. And so, I think Russell probably, if he's the starter, put up similar numbers to last year, maybe a little better just because the defense is better and he'll get more possessions, in good field position. But I'm not like excited about Russell Wilson in Pittsburgh by any stretch. So this one I kind of just shrugged my shoulders and said, okay, Russell Wilson's trying a third team. What did you think, or what do you think about his prospects for this season?
Yeah, kind of like you. Look, statistically, Wilson wasn't as bad as everyone thinks, and the Steelers might have gotten a potential steal in Wilson, as far as in my opinion. And I think Tomlin will command Russ's respect, and could be the coach to resurrect his career. I really do feel that way.
So one more quarterback that I want to talk about, or at least one, but it's Justin Fields, and I think it's become pretty clear, and I don't know if this is the team leaking this or it's just become very clear, that the Bears are likely to take Caleb Williams with the first pick, and that makes Justin Fields expendable. And I think the thinking was that one of these QB needy teams like the Vikings, who've added Sam Darnold, or the Raiders who've added Gardner Minshew, or the Steelers who we just talked about who've added Russell Wilson, that one of these teams was going to give the Bears a fair asking price for Fields. They would move Fields and they would take Williams at number one. Chicago still hasn't found a trade partner for Fields, and a lot of reporting out there and listening to what I just said, that the trade market might be kind of drying up for him. What would you do now if you were Chicago's GM, and how desperate should they be to try to find a deal for him?
If I were the GM of the Chicago Bears, I don't think I'd do much differently than what Ryan Poles has done. I might not have given DeAndre Swift $24 million, but I like re-signing Jalen Johnson and adding all-pro safety Kevin Byard. In regards to the Fields move, I like how Poles is handling it by not forcing a trade, and maybe just taking a deal just to get him off the roster. Avoid the dramas. Kind of stay out of the news and whatnot. But if I were Poles, I think I'd be trying harder to trade that number one overall pick. I do think after pro days and everything, especially after Caleb Williams' pro day, maybe we'll start to hear some discussions about teams interested in trading up to number one and things like that. But I haven't really, I have no issues with how Poles has been handling the situation. How about you?
No, I agree. I mean, I think, I think there's a couple different times where a trade for Fields could happen. One is now, and it hasn't happened, as quarterbacks were changing teams. Another one is around and after the draft. It might be that on draft night, someone makes a trade for Fields, or shortly after the draft, a team that didn't get the guy they wanted or wasn't able to get one of the, top 3 or 4 quarterbacks. And then I think, look, if Poles is a smart GM, and I think he's done well in the last couple of years, a great job getting that trade last year with the Panthers, which is why they have this luxury of having Justin Fields and having the number one pick. All right, the Chase Claypool trade was stupid, but everyone makes everyone makes a mistake here and there. I think generally speaking, and you outlined some good moves they've made so far in free agency, I think this is a team that is doing things the right way. But the third time that they might be able to trade Fields is during training camp. Like, you remember the Sam Bradford thing a bunch of years ago, where, he was burning a hole. I forget which team it was even, and a starter got hurt in training camp, and all of a sudden a team that's good is desperate for a starter, and comes knocking, and you get the price you want. So I think he should be patient. Worst thing that happens is you draft a QB and you've got 2 young QBs on your roster and they compete. Not the end of the world. But I think eventually this will work itself out. I do think they're going to take a quarterback, though. I don't think that just because I don't think they've seen enough from Fields that they want to move forward with him as their starting QB, based on things I've read. And so if they can't trade Fields, I don't think that's going to impact at all whether they take a QB at number one. And I still think they're going to do that. Now, if someone comes along and offers them 4 first-round picks, maybe they say, you know what, it's worth it. And especially if they're only sliding down to 2 or 3,
right,
with Washington or New England. Now, they wouldn't be getting 4 first-round picks from them, but and you can still draft a quarterback that you like almost as much as Williams, or that you like as much as Williams, and get extra draft capital. I could see them doing that.
Definitely, I wouldn't be mad about that. That's one situation that I thought would have been one of the first things to kind of handle itself here in the offseason, but here we are, and Justin Fields is still a Bear, and the number 1 overall pick still belongs to the Bears. So it'll be fun to see how this all pans out.
Agree.
So which teams makes the most sense for Fields, Dave? And is it possible he isn't an opening day starter in 2024?
Well, barring an injury or something, it is starting to look like that's at least somewhat possible. Obviously the Vikings added Sam Darnold. That seems like kind of a bridge situation. But maybe they do want to give him a chance, and they think that, he's shown enough in some of the different stops in his career that in the right system and with those weapons that they have in Minnesota, that maybe he can resurrect his career. The Raiders were another team. They added Minshew, same kind of deal. Like that doesn't mean they won't be interested in Justin Fields, but it does complicate it a little bit. Same with the Steelers with Russell Wilson. That doesn't leave that many teams. There's the Broncos, but I kind of don't see Sean Payton wanting a quarterback like Justin Fields. I just don't see that as a fit. Payton has a very specific idea for the type of quarterback that works in his system. And it's someone who, like Drew Brees, makes quick decisions, is very precise, very accurate, balls out on time. And that's not Justin Fields. Justin Fields more of an improviser, a runner, doesn't throw great off platform and things like that. So
right.
I don't know. I'm looking around the league, and maybe someone trades for him as a backup, as a high-end backup, like a team that isn't really sure about its starter. I mean, the other 2 teams that really need quarterbacks are the Commanders and the Patriots, and they're picking in the top 3. So, and are presumably going to take quarterbacks. Maybe they won't, but probably they will. So I'm not really sure. What do you think? I mean, do you think there's a team out there that makes sense at this point?
Well, I think the Raiders do make sense. However, what didn't make sense was giving Gardner Minshew $24 million.
Yeah, they paid him a lot.
That was a strange move, especially for a guy that, I mean, I guess he might be a bridge. He might be a backup. I mean, quarterbacks get paid, but I thought that was a lot of money. I guess they plan on him being the starter. But yeah, I thought the Raiders made a lot of sense. And then this might not make as much sense, but I could see them doing this because to get a starting franchise quarterback potentially at a discounted rate would be the Washington Commanders. I know they have the 2nd overall pick, but I mean, they might be able to knock on the door of the Bears and say, hey, we'll give you our 2nd round pick for Justin Fields. And maybe Ryan Poles would accept that. Yeah,
possibly. I do wonder what his asking price is. Like if they're actively shopping Fields, is it a 2nd? I would have sort of thought it's a 2nd. A 2nd,
I would think so.
Or maybe like 2/3 or something like that. But anyway, I think we've pretty much covered all the running backs and quarterbacks that have moved around, or at least the bigger names. So thinking about everything, all the positions on the field, after 3 days, Paul, which teams do you think are having the best off season? And when I say off season, I'm really just talking about the free agency period that has opened, not about like hiring coaches and all of that other stuff that's already happened in the offseason. But just from a player personnel standpoint and what you've seen over the last 3 days. And why don't you we'll each do one NFC, one AFC.
So I'll start with the AFC team, and I really like what the Houston Texans have done. They go out and make a good trade for Joe Mixon, experienced playoff running back. They add Daniil Hunter to that defense to pair with Will Anderson, and they also got another defensive tackle. I don't remember who it was. Forgive me for not having the names written down, but I like them going out, solidifying their defense, strengthening what was, with the weaker part of that team. And then the NFC team, I'm a big fan of what the Giants have done so far.
Okay.
How about you?
For me, I'll go with the Packers in the NFC. That maybe it's good not to have a real owner,
right?
Just be owned by the public, because the Packers seem to kind of do things right most off seasons. I think it was smart to sort of finally let David Bakhtiari go. He's older. He's been hurt like every year, the last bunch of years. Aaron Jones had a great finish last year, but he got hurt 2 different times during the season. They got younger at running back by kind of just basically trading him in for Josh Jacobs. I like bringing in Xavier McKinney. I just think that they've, for a team that was clearly on the rise at the end of the season, they have made some moves that I think help the team. Not all that troubled that they let Darnell Savage walk. I think that they're handling this off season well, and they're going to be a trendy. I know the Lions are in their division, and they were the like kind of trendy pick last year. I think the Packers are going to be a pretty trendy, could they win the NFC kind of pick next year? And in the AFC, I like what the Texans have done. That's a good one. And I like what the Ravens have done. Like, they made it a priority to pay Justin Matabuke, the outstanding defensive tackle. They got that done. I think bringing in Derrick Henry, of all the running backs that were out there, he probably made the most sense for them, and they could do it on sort of a shorter deal. Pay him a lot, but not a ridiculous amount of money. I'm not really troubled that they let Patrick Queen walk. I know he had a good year last year, but he really wasn't that good a player before Roquan Smith got there. And I think they kind of know his limitations. And they just, Eric DaCosta just manages this process so well, kind of like Ozzie Newsome before him. And I think the Ravens have had a good couple of days, for a team that, was probably reeling since they lost the AFC title game. They're not panicking. They know they have a good team, and they're doing the little things they need to do to make that team better for next season.
They always draft so well every year too.
Yeah, and that's the other thing. They're picking really late in the first round. They'll pick someone who, like when they drafted Kyle Hamilton, or they've done it so many times.
Yeah.
Drafting really good players, not just in round 1.
Well, they have like the players rising in value and losing value. Of course, teams have that same issue. Which teams are having the worst offseason in your eyes?
So my AFC one, I'll go with the Denver Broncos, only because it's crazy that they're taking an $85 million cap hit on Russell Wilson. I mean, he didn't play that bad last year. I mean, I know that Russ has rubbed some teammates the wrong way, but I just kind of don't understand how they've handled this whole thing. When you look at the compensation that they gave up both for him and for Sean Payton, I just kind of don't know what this team is doing. And they've really, they've let Justin Simmons walk. He's a good safety. They haven't really brought anyone in of note. Jerry Jeudy, I think that's fine to let him go. He hasn't really lived up to it.
Yeah.
But I don't understand their offseason so far, and I don't see how they've done anything to make their team better. I mean, you could kind of say the same thing about the Cowboys. I mean, I know they brought in Kendricks, and I don't know who they're running. I mean, is Rico Dowdle going to be their running back this year? I don't know. But I'll go with the Panthers in the NFC. I just think they've been a clown show the last 3 years. I don't know if David Tepper is too involved. But they've had like 3 coaches in 3 years. Their best players, if you look at their roster from 3 years ago, their best players were Christian McCaffrey, DJ Moore, and Brian Burns, right? And they're all gone. You haven't replaced them with much. So I do like the Deontay Johnson trade that they made. Like I think, give Bryce Young like a guy who gets open all the time in the short area. Like Adam Thielen was their best receiver last year, and he's like 34. Deontay Johnson is a really good wide receiver who is a catch machine. So I think that'll help Bryce Young a lot. But other than that, I'll give them my failing grade. How about you? Which teams do you think have had the worst week this week?
Definitely have to put my Cowboys up there. I mean, to lose that way in the first round, and then you lose all the players you did lose. Who, I mean, those are key players. Those are guys who were putting in meaningful reps. Meaningful snaps. Rather, playing meaningful snaps every week. In addition to losing Dan Quinn, which I was okay with, but just losing a lot and not really doing much of anything. Of course, they bring in a veteran linebacker, Eric Kendricks, which familiar with Mike Zimmer, and adding a veteran presence to a young linebacker room, that's always important. And the AFC team, I think Denver, that's a good one. So I'm going to steal that one because I guess I forgot to answer it. I have 3 question marks by it here on the show sheet, Dave. So I guess I was thinking, and I forgot to go over that.
Well, the other thing with Denver that the last point I'll make is, like, you're in the division with the Chiefs. You're in a division with the Chargers, who have Justin Herbert. By the way, he's another quarterback that got hurt last year that didn't finish as top 10 QB, and that you can expect will this coming year.
For sure.
But what do you call it? They bring in Jim Harbaugh. They're obviously a team that has a talented roster, could be on the rise. The Raiders have made some big moves so far in free agency. I just don't see how Denver is going to compete in that division. I mean, you never know. They do have some good players. I mean, they have some really good players on defense, especially in their secondary. And you saw them win some, they beat the Chiefs last year, and they got hot at the end of the season, and they played well. I don't know what's going on there, and they don't have a quarterback right now. And maybe they're a team that's going to trade up, with the Giants or someone else who's picking, in the top 10 to get one of those 4 quarterbacks. We'll see.
Yeah, we will. All right, Dave, here we are. We end every episode with a bold prediction, this being the off-season edition. Dave, give me your bold prediction for the off-season.
My bold prediction is that the Bears are not going to be able to find a trading partner for Justin Fields before training camps open, and will only find one if a starting quarterback gets hurt in the preseason and a team gets desperate. What is your bold call for this offseason right now?
All right, Dave. So there's my favorite radio station, talk radio, of course, being sports talk, of course, is 105.3 The Fan, a local sports station here in Texas. 105.3 The Fan. I'm stealing this from them. They were talking a little bit about this, and I don't know if they exactly said this because I didn't catch the beginning of it, but I'll say I think that the Minnesota Vikings trade Justin Jefferson to the Chicago Bears for the number 1 overall pick.
Wow. Well, Jefferson did turn down $30 million a year from them.
He did. So that's crazy.
He may be, the Vikings, if they think they can't keep him long term, they could move him, for the right price. So that's an interesting one. That is bold, Paul. Can always count on you for a very bold call, but that's interesting.
Bold, crazy, dumb, whatever we want to call it. Right?
No. Listen, crazy stuff has happened in the NFL the last 2 off seasons. And if one other thing we should think about is, like, if you look at last season, in the last 2 seasons, there have been some big trades on draft night also, right? Like Marquise Brown and AJ Brown got traded for draft picks like during the first round. So we can't discount that those kind of things won't happen this year either. With important players moving during the draft. And then if you think to like Tyreek Hill, he was traded in March. He was traded like after free agency. I can't remember when Devontae Adams was traded, but this is a whole fluid thing. Like I think a lot of people look at this week, and if their team hasn't done much, they start to say, oh, what is my GM doing? Like all these teams are adding these great players. Well, look, some teams are spending money foolishly. And so you're glad that, let them spend that money on a player that your team doesn't want or doesn't need or doesn't value as highly, or that you don't think would be a good fit. Sometimes stuff happens after these first couple of days of free agency. I mean, this is just one piece of the offseason. The draft, obviously, a big piece also. And there, and then there's like cuts and, guys who get picked up and all that other stuff that happens to ultimately shape your team's roster. So what I would say to people listening who are just dissatisfied with what their team has done so far this week, I would just say, well, if you're a Panther fan, I'll say, well, get used to it because that's who they are now. And I'm sorry. But, if you're a fan of other teams, I would say be patient. It's just the beginning and you still got the draft and you still got potentially other offseason free agency or trade moves that could happen. So have faith in your GM.
I like that, man. Well said. Great way to end the episode.
Yeah.
Dave, before we get you out of here, remind the people they can find you on X, and what kind of content can we be expecting from you?
The content question is a good one because I haven't written anything in a little bit. There's a lot of things I've wanted to write about and I haven't. So I do hope to get some off-season NFL content, or at least off-season fantasy content, up on my website in the coming weeks. But you can find me on X at PigskinPapers, and my website is thepigskinpapers.com. And Paul, where can people find you and get your content?
Yes, guys, make sure to follow the YouTube channel, the Across the Cowboys podcast. Every day I am uploading a short form video. I'd love for you guys to join me on that journey as I try to stay at the forefront of your minds, try to keep you guys updated on all things Cowboys. And you can, of course, find my content in addition to on YouTube, but on Twitter every Monday night. Our off-season content is more guest-focused, of course, discussing all things Cowboys. A lot of different series, entertaining, most importantly, informative. I hope you guys will join us on that journey as well. And you can find me on Twitter, aka X, at Paula_Ryan15. We appreciate you joining us, and we will see you guys next week.
Excellent. Good night, everyone.